Thomas Hargrove's truck ground to a halt on the weed-choked driveway, the engine sputtering its last before dying completely. Perfect. Just perfect. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel and climbed out, the autumn air biting through his thin jacket. The farmhouse loomed before him, a decrepit sentinel against the gray October sky. Windows like dead eyes stared down at him, their glass clouded with decades of neglect. He'd sunk every penny he had into this place. After the divorce, after Sarah took everything, this was his last chance to start over. The realtor had warned him about the property's history, about why it was so cheap, but Thomas hadn't listened. Ghost stories and local superstitions weren't going to stop him from turning these 100 acres into something profitable. The front door creaked open at his touch, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of rot and abandonment. Thomas stepped inside, his boots leaving prints in the thick dust. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he moved from room to room, mentally cataloging repairs. Broken windows. Crumbling plaster. Water damage in the ceiling. Nothing he couldn't fix. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and something caught his eye through the kitchen's grimy glass. At the edge of the overgrown field, just beyond a crumbling stone wall, stood a massive oak tree. Its trunk was twisted and black, its branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. But it was what hung from those branches that made Thomas's blood run cold. Bones. Dozens of them, bleached white by the sun, dangling like macabre wind chimes. Ribs. Femurs. Skulls of varying sizes, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch his every move. Thomas blinked hard, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. But when he opened his eyes, the bones were still there, swaying gently in the breeze. "It's just some sick joke," he muttered, grabbing a crowbar from his truck. "Probably local kids trying to scare off buyers." The grass whispered against his legs as he approached the tree. Up close, the bones looked disturbingly real. A child's skull hung at eye level, its jaw hanging open in an eternal scream. Thomas reached out to touch it, to prove to himself it was just plastic. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Thomas spun around, crowbar raised. An old man stood there, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but they fixed on Thomas with unnerving precision. "This is private property," Thomas said, lowering the crowbar slightly. "Private?" The old man's laugh was dry as dead leaves. "Nothing's private here. Not anymore. Not since the tree changed." "What are you talking about? Who put these things here?" "The tree did. It grows them. Like fruit. Every full moon, new bones appear. Sometimes they're fresh, still dripping. Sometimes they're old, yellow with age. But they all come from the same place." "That's enough," Thomas said. "I don't believe in ghost stories." The old man's smile revealed teeth as yellow as old bone. "Then touch it. Go ahead. Put your hand on the trunk. See what happens." Thomas looked at the tree. Its bark seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, but when he looked directly at it, it was still. Just a tree. Just a stupid tree with some bones tied to it. He stepped forward, determined to prove the old man wrong. His hand pressed against the bark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cold hit him, a deep, penetrating chill that shot up his arm and into his chest. He tried to pull away, but his hand wouldn't move. The bark beneath his palm felt soft, pulsing, like flesh. Images flooded his mind, bodies hanging from branches, their flesh melting away until only bones remained. Children screaming as roots burst from the ground, wrapping around their ankles. The earth splitting open, revealing a vast darkness filled with writhing shapes and ancient hunger. Thomas wrenched his hand free with a cry of pain. The skin of his palm was blistered, as if he'd grabbed a hot coal. The old man watched him with something like pity. "Now you know," he said. "The tree has tasted you. It knows your fear. And it will come for you, Thomas Hargrove. Just like it came for all the others." "How do you know my name?" Thomas demanded. "I never told you." But the old man was gone. The field was empty, save for the whispering grass and the clicking of bones in the wind. Thomas backed away from the tree, his blistered hand throbbing in time with his racing heart. He turned and ran for the farmhouse, not stopping until he was inside with the door locked behind him. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. Thomas sat in the kitchen, a bottle of whiskey and his shotgun laid out on the table before him. His hands still burned where he'd touched the tree, the blisters now an angry red. He told himself he'd leave in the morning. Call the realtor, break the contract, eat the deposit. Anything to get away from this place. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The tree had tasted him, just as the old man said. And now something was coming. The first tap at the window was so soft he almost missed it. Then it came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 like bone against glass. Thomas raised the shotgun with trembling hands and turned toward the sound. There, pressed against the window, was a skeletal hand, its finger bones clicking against the pane. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure made entirely of bones, its skull tilted at an impossible angle. And it was smiling. The shotgun blast shattered both the window and the skeletal hand into fragments of glass and bone. Thomas stumbled backward, his ears ringing, as more figures emerged from the darkness. They moved with an unnatural grace, their bones clicking and scraping together like terrible instruments. He fired again and again, each blast taking another skeleton apart. But for every one he destroyed, two more appeared. They poured through the broken window, reassembling themselves from scattered pieces, their hollow eye sockets gleaming with pale blue light. Thomas ran. Through the kitchen, down the hall, taking the stairs two at a time. The bones scraped against the walls behind him, getting closer. He slammed his bedroom door shut and wedged a chair under the handle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the shotgun. "This isn't real," he gasped. "This can't be real." The door shuddered under the impact of bony fists. Wood splintered. Thomas backed toward the window, his mind racing. The drop was too far, he'd break both legs. But staying meant death, or worse. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. Skeletal hands reached for him. Thomas swung the shotgun like a club, shattering a skull, but another skeleton grabbed his arm. Its grip was like ice, burning through his sleeve. He screamed as more hands seized him, dragging him toward the doorway. They pulled him down the stairs, his body bouncing against each step. His struggles were useless against their inexorable strength. Through the front door they dragged him, across the moonlit field toward the waiting tree. The earth around its base had split open, revealing a pulsing darkness that seemed to swallow the moonlight. The tree's branches writhed like tentacles, the bones hanging from them chittering and clicking in excitement. As they drew closer, Thomas saw movement in the darkness below, thousands of bones shifting and flowing like a tide of death. "Please," he begged. "Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back." A familiar laugh cut through the night. The old man stepped out from behind the tree, but he looked different now. His skin had turned gray and papery, stretched tight over prominent bones. His cataract-clouded eyes glowed with the same pale blue light as the skeleton's. "The tree must feed," the old man said, his voice resonating with unnatural depth. "It's been so hungry, waiting for someone like you. Someone who doesn't believe. Someone who needs to learn respect." The skeletons forced Thomas to his knees at the edge of the pit. The darkness below seemed to reach for him with tendrils of pure shadow. The old man approached, his walking stick now a staff of twisted bone. "I tried to warn you," he said. "But some lessons can only be taught through pain." He pressed his hand against Thomas's forehead. The touch was like burning ice, sending waves of agony through his skull. Images flooded his mind, the old man, centuries younger, defiling the sacred tree. The spirits rising in anger, transforming him into their eternal servant. Generations of victims fed to the hungry earth below. "You'll serve as I serve," the old man whispered. "Forever." Thomas felt something inside him crack. Not his bones, something deeper. His soul, perhaps. The darkness reached up with eager hands, pulling him down into its cold embrace. He tried to scream, but his mouth was already filling with soil. The last thing he saw was the old man's smile, his teeth now sharp and gleaming in the moonlight. Then the earth closed over him, and Thomas Hargrove ceased to exist. Days later, a realtor stood before the farmhouse, speaking to a young couple. "It's a great property," she said brightly. "The last owner disappeared without a trace, so the bank's practically giving it away. Just needs a little TLC." The couple walked the overgrown field, discussing renovation plans. They didn't notice the tree at first, its branches heavy with bones. But among the weathered skulls and ribs hung something new, a skeleton still wearing scraps of familiar clothing, its jaw frozen in an eternal scream. The old man watched from the shadows, leaning on his staff of bone. Soon they would see the tree. Soon they would touch it, despite his warnings. And the harvest would begin again. In time, they all became part of the tree. In time, they all learned to sing with the bones. High above, in the twisted branches, Thomas's skeleton swayed in the breeze. His hollow eye sockets glowed with pale blue light, and his bony fingers clicked against his neighbors, adding his voice to their eternal chorus. The song of the bone tree, a hymn of hunger and patience, whispered across the fields, warning those who would listen, calling to those who would not. Waiting. Always waiting.